Hi guys and welcome to Type 40.
It's time for Type 40, a Doctor Who podcast from the Spacebook for the Fandom Podcast Network. I'm Dan Hadley, Birmingham's king of the geeks, your regular host, patiently hovering over as much of the Whoniverse as possible, the past, the present, and the future, here on your free-speaking, big-thinking show, 15 incarnations of the Time Lord, 61 years and counting. Whenever, wherever, and however you started your journey with the Doctor, we're on it. Here at Type 40. This is something that harkens back to a really dark time for Doctor Who fans that we've got on the agenda this time. So thank heaven I've got Sarah Graham and Simon Horton here to aid me reliving one of the most solemn evenings of my younger life. Both this was awful.
Was it? You see, I can't remember, Dan. I'm trying to think back with this now, and I was definitely out of love with Doctor Who at this point. Anyway, truth be told, I was done with Doctor Who for the first time.
I mean, in the here and now, we've got another Doctor Who anniversary that's just in the rear view mirror. So, how did you mark Doctor Who's 61st birthday this year, Sarah? How was that for you?
It was different, a little bit more muted actually. I'm not going to be all melodramatic and say there's nothing to celebrate, because there's always something to celebrate. Obviously, I haven't taken to the new era as much as other fans have. But it doesn't stop me loving Doctor Who. So yeah, I did my usual thing of watching the Five Doctors reboot. And I even got one of the old proms up that was on the iPlayer, so I watched the first one that was presented by Freema Agyeman, looking absolutely stunning. And yes, lots of good feelings, and I marked it in my own way. So I got that mixture of classic and then my era that I loved.
Yeah, that's it. Let the music of Murray Gold from when he was really good wash over you. Yeah. How about you, Simon? Because, we've seen a few anniversaries come and go now. I mean, 61, it's not a big number, but it is a big number because they're all big numbers after a certain number. How did you mark the 61st anniversary?
Do you know, it's really funny. I didn't mark it at all for various complicated reasons. But basically, to begin with, no, I wasn't. It wasn't that I'd forgotten about it so much as I had a lot on that week, and I had a lot on that weekend. And I got a phone call at around about 10 o'clock on the morning of the 23rd, on the Saturday, from Steve, who is one of the long-time viewers of this show. So hello, Steve. I know you'll be watching this.
Steve.
Yeah, and he phoned to say, and I just answered the phone, and he said, "Oh, happy Doctor Who Day," and I'm like, Gosh, yeah, it is, isn't it? And I had completely forgotten. I think I was doing something really boring, like the washing up at the time, and I'd just completely forgotten that it was Doctor Who Day. Now, part of the reason I'd forgotten was because I'd got a friend from New York stopping that weekend. So at that time, I was literally madly rushing around the house, just getting the house ready.
You're allowed to have another life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's funny. It's funny because pretty much the first thing he said when he walked through the door was, I saw on social media this morning as I was coming over to you, apparently today's the anniversary of the first episode of Doctor Who. And I'm like, yes, as a matter of fact.
Oh, that's so lovely that they'd said it to you.
I know, it was really bizarre. So although we didn't actually mark Doctor Who Day and that we didn't watch anything, because I'd got friends here, and so I was really tempted to sort of put an Unearthly Child on, but I thought, I don't know, maybe I'm pushing it a bit here. So we didn't mark it in any way, but actually, I've got really fun memories of the 61st anniversary for completely strange reasons. So I'll forever remember Steve phoning me up, and then my friends from New York turning up and telling me, in case I hadn't realised, that did you know it's the 61st anniversary of Doctor Who?
I think they both absolutely count as good memories.
There you go. What did you do then, Dan?
What did I do? Well, believe it or not, I revisited this time a curious piece of Who history, the pilot version of An Unearthly Child.
Brilliant.
And what led me to this was actually when I recalled how the last time I'd watched An Unearthly Child was with you both on this show. You know, we watched it in real time, all together for the very first time. And so, you know, we're about a year later, and I thought, well, I can't watch it again. It's still quite fresh in my mind. But I will go and watch the pilot. And I came away with having noted things that I'd noted and that had amused me before, as always happens when you look at an alternative version of something. But there are also lots of little things here and there that I hadn't seen before, that I hadn't made a note of before, or I simply hadn't been able to see before, because this was the first time that I was watching it on my far, far larger new telly with an upscaled picture. So there was lots of little things. I was trying to climb into the screen, Sarah. It was sad to see.
That no, we're not sad. No, but no, it gives you that extra appreciation. You see the details, you know, in the junkyard and that beautiful TARDIS interior, and I'm quite envious actually that you did that. Yeah,
really good.
Yeah, it's still such both a pilot and an Unearthly Child. I still think it's just such cracking episodes. I still have this theory that if that's first episode hadn't been as good as it was, we might not be here 61 years later. It's still okay. It is old and it's creaky and it's slow and all the rest of it, but I wouldn't change a single bit of that, of the first episode. But I love the pilot as well. Because it's not. Look, it isn't that different. There aren't that many differences. But what differences there are, I like. I mean, we've spoken about this before, but I still love the thunderclap on the title music. You know, I love stuff like that, and so I still think that the pilot episode has sufficient differences to make it valid in its own right and enjoyable in its own right on a completely different level to the actual broadcast episode.
On one hand, I was looking at things like the trim around the sign on the police box door being a lot brighter white, and with an upscaled picture too, you can actually see the brush strokes. You can see it's been painted. So I was looking at that, but I was also looking at and thinking about the costume that Carol Ann Ford wears in the second half in the TARDIS. It's kind of like a tunic with the collars pointed out, and I don't think I'd noticed before how the tunic itself is quite silvery and much more overtly sci-fi. It's more like something that the cast of Lost in Space wear.
Yes.
I thought, I wonder if that was a concerted effort. And then I thought, well, what did she wear in the broadcast? I went and looked, and obviously it was like a sweater, a 1960s sweater. I thought, okay, that was a choice. And I thought to myself, well, maybe does that mean, because the Doctor in the pilot one as well is wearing a suit with a tie, a suit of its day. And I thought, well, does that mean if Ian and Barbara hadn't have interrupted the Doctor on his way back to the TARDIS, maybe he also has a silvery tunic that he would change back into. That, was that Gallifreyan garb, if you like, were those fashions from the 49th century? We'll never know now, will we?
Well, possibly.
It's fascinating to speculate.
And of course, one of the things that happened there was Sidney Newman specifically requested a change of the costumes, certainly for Carol Ann Ford.
Yes.
For that very reason, that he felt that it was too sort of on the nose. It was too sci-fi, and he wanted Carol Ann, Susan to be far more down to earth, and that the audience could relate to. And so he wanted her bringing down a little bit, not quite so weird as a character, and that was one of the choices that was made. But it's a shame, because I love that tunic in the I wonder where that is now. Whatever happened to that tunic? Can you imagine?
I think it probably went on to be lots of other costumes on lots of other shows,
so.
Either in its full form or maybe taken apart, recycled, upcycled, as they now call
I
it.
reckon it was probably on Space 1999 or something like that.
Or Blake 7. It might well have turned up on Blake 7. It could well have done. Or it might be somewhere else in Doctor Who, somewhere in the Robots of Death or something. You just don't know. You don't know.
Well, me watching the pilot there and thinking back to our experience watching the broadcast version is partly what's inspired this particular edition of the show, our comeback show after a little break. First break in a few years, so it is allowed. But before we get to that, I'm going to remind you that if you want to do some real-life digital time travelling of your own, each and every edition of Type 40 past, present and future is only a tap or two away on the device of your choice, if you know where to look, of course. It's an ageless mix of reviews, previews, interviews, geekouts and deep dives with all our regular panellists and lots of awesome guests. There's something for every fan over at type40.podbean.com. More on that a little later on, as well as a spot for us to plug our sister and brother, cousins and other podcasts across the fabulous Fandom Podcast Network too. Back to the 80s now. Well, just about. The 80s, the very tail end of the greatest, most colourful and most electronic of decades, when Wogan was the one show and time was up for our Time Lord now. Nothing lasts forever. We're all reminded that far too often as we make our way through life. You'd have been forgiven for thinking, though, that Doctor Who, that might have done if you'd been a child of the 60s, the 70s, or the 80s. For much of that time, the notion it wouldn't be there somewhere in the schedules was sort of a fantasy in itself. The show had weathered trends and positively ran through phases of its own, reinventing itself with confidence, with gusto, even surviving an actual cancellation at the hands of the devilish Michael Grade in the mid-80s. Within a couple of years, though, the wheels did seem back on. That was until they weren't. It became common sort of knowledge in mid-1989 that Doctor Who could be slipping away for a time, at least, which seems very odd when you look back, Simon, because even now, those involved at the BBC and various other places do insist how they never intended this to have been it for the classic series. But on the 6th of December, that's 35 years ago this very week, the classic production did air its final episode. Can you remember where you were when you first heard the idea that Doctor Who might not be coming back?
Do you know, I can't, because I think it wasn't made public at the time. I'm pretty sure. I wish I could remember this clearer. It's odd because I can remember 100% exactly where I was when I heard about the first cancellation, whatever you want to call it, in 1986. That, 85, sorry, that I remember literally as clear as yesterday. And with the final sort of cancellation in 89, no, I can't remember. And this is what makes me think it wasn't really announced. As I recall, we didn't know that the show was shelved, and that Survival Episode 3 was the last one. And I don't think it was ever announced, as I recall. It just sort of dimly went on, as in it just didn't come back. It was never announced that it wasn't coming back or it was cancelled. It just sort of eked out. We just sort of got to the feeling of thinking, it's not coming back, is it? And so that's my memory of it. That I think it just sort of it drifted along without anybody really being too certain of, is it cancelled? Is it not cancelled? Is it
The
coming
idea
back?
was floating in the air. And I think
Yes,
had I been a
very
little
much.
older, I'd have realised that they were kind of, because they'd cataclysmically announced that the show was being axed just 4 years earlier.
Yes.
And all hell had broken loose. And I do think that some of the people involved at the BBC hadn't necessarily intended to be closing the doors permanently, but I think they had a fair idea that when a production closes down, it closes down. So leaving that penny to drop kind of in our own time, Sarah,
Yes.
I think it was a way. Did they view it as a kindness for the fan base? That's pretty unlikely, but it is possible that they just wanted to sort of preempt another furore.
Well, yeah, because it's well documented. 1985, the headlines. The newspaper. Ian Levine famously with that TV, and I'm pretty sure that they didn't want a repeat to that.
Yes.
But yeah, it's looking at it now, it just seemed really cruel. I think sometimes honesty is probably the best policy.
I think also, Sarah, I do feel at the time it did feel cowardly, and it still does feel cowardly. They should have just, if they knew behind the scenes that they would not bring it back, they should have just said, "Don't hold your breath waiting. I'm sorry, we're not renewing it anytime soon."
Do you think it's a kindness, Simon, or is it the ultimate? Is it a kind of an act of the opposite? Really, is it total disrespect?
I think it's the opposite.
Total disregard.
I think it is disrespectful, because I can just remember, say, back to those days. It's all through the early 90s. Constantly, there were rumours always appearing in Gallifrey Guardian that it might be coming back, or there might be a film, or there might be. And it was a really unpleasant time to be a fan, because, as I say, my recollection is that we just all eventually came to this realization that it wasn't coming back, and I think that's a lot crueler than just saying
it was very cruel.
Sorry,
I mean, there
we're not
wasn't
renewing
even
it.
a scrap about it in Second Dimension either. I've been looking, and I can't see a bloody word. I mean, I don't know.
Brilliant.
Well, there you go. Then
go.
there wasn't an announcement, because we would have known about it.
Look at that. That's a blast from the past. That is, we didn't know. Well, we didn't know, and I think we were all talking about it. And I think, as you say, Dan, it was very much in the air. We were very aware. But to be honest, we'd been aware right the way through the Sylvester McCoy years. There was always, I can remember,
Yeah,
at
just
the end
that
of
thing.
each of the McCoy seasons, there was always that thought of, we were all asking the questions, is it coming back next year? And so that was why in 1989, when Survival aired, we didn't really ask any more questions than, is it coming back for the next season? Because it was the question we'd asked at the end of each season for the past 3 years. So it didn't feel particularly odd. It didn't feel particularly final, because there genuinely was a feeling throughout the whole of the McCoy run that it might get axed at any minute, literally any minute. And so I
And
don't
for
think
all
took
the
anything
things,
granted.
that you could level at John Nathan Turner, that wouldn't be one of them. That he would mislead, that he would be cruel, that he would be that dismissive of his audience. He may have manipulated us for better or for worse at various junctions, but I think that's a slightly different question, Sarah. That he would just simply not say or lead us to believe something that was true that wasn't.
Yeah, I don't think he was that person at all. I mean, he loved this show. He loved it so much that he couldn't leave. So for him to, I imagine the decision was already pretty much made higher up, and I think there were a lot of secrets up there. But then again, looking back, you think, well, the number of stories was getting shorter, especially over the McCoy time. I mean, looking back and piecing it all together, you can see how it's slowly drawing
Yes.
to a close. But I suppose at the time when you're living through that, you're just grateful, it's back on. Oh, we've got another season with McCoy.
That was exactly how it was, Sarah. Literally, I remember getting to the announcement of the forthcoming McCoy season, and you did breathe a sigh of relief, as in, oh, okay, it is coming back again. But it was 3 years of living on sort of tenterhooks of not knowing whether it would come back, whether it would work, and whether and I still wonder whether the decision was made behind the scenes that was it, we are axing it, or whether it was almost a more cowardly act going on behind the scenes as well, that actually they just avoided making the decision. I'd be interested to know, did they make a decision behind the scenes, the people on the 6th floor, as they were famously known?
In all
Did they make that
fairness,
decision that it was
in all
gone?
fairness, they were under pressure at that point where the culture of the BBC was changing.
Yes.
That was expected of them and asked of them from the government charter was changing because they had to farm out so many things to independence.
Correct.
By law. And so in some respects you think perhaps Doctor Who, it's perfectly reasonable that be one of them. Take a look at the slate of shows. Which shows can we potentially offer out? And we know that that Doctor Who was offered out because Paul Stone has spoken about how he turned it down. He had the opportunity to produce it independently, and so did Verity Lambert and various other people. So we know that that's true. But even so, you think, well, if they'd have wanted to that badly, it would have just been sold.
And I think that is part of the problem. The BBC, I'm not sure if they've ever actually wanted Doctor Who that badly. They have when it's going well.
Yeah.
They've wanted to drop it when it's not going well. And the in-between bits, they don't really know what to do with it. They're confused by it. I still think there is a degree of embarrassment by the BBC that this thing is so successful that they can't quite put their finger on as a format, and I think that's I do think that subconsciously it's a source of frustration too, that they're not able to define what it is about Doctor Who that worked, and so as a result they can't recreate it in any of their other shows, and I think it is a source of frustration. And so I wonder whether that's part of the problem with Doctor Who, and that's why eventually I just wonder whether they just gave up and didn't bother making the decision. They just sort of kicked the can down the road, as the modern parlance is.
Sarah, from your perspective, I think if I'd come along to Doctor Who later and looking back at this sort of web of intrigue and this sort of rise and fall, at the end of the day, if you detach yourself from the fact that you were there and living it, TV shows come and go all the time. They start, they end. 26 years is a long time. Is it weird to you that we didn't really see this coming, or that we felt that it should have carried on? Because you got 26 straight years. What more do you want? Does it seem strange?
No, because I'm obsessed with it as well. You've got to be a fan. Because the way I felt about the reboot, and that only, how many years did that run for? Well, it's technically it's still going, but when it was running well, the idea of it not coming back was horrifying to me. And that was me coming as a young adult, So for somebody who's been brought up on this, who's watched it like you, Simon, from very young,
yes,
your childhood's tied to it, your childhood's tied to it as well, Dan, and it's always been there in the fabric, of your life and on the TV. And obviously TV's changed as well, but I am still, I'm on that coast where I can remember, programs being the fabric of you sat down as a family on a Saturday night. I can still remember that. It's completely changed now, for children nowadays. But there was something about watching TV as a family that is just ingrained in you, and and particularly in our culture as well. So I can completely understand like the level of devastation, and you think, and with it coming back, so you've had that false alarm with Colin Baker, but it's back, and to have been a child at that time, I just think it's absolutely heartbreaking if you were watching it at the time, like you were, Dan. And yeah, my heart
I
just
think
goes out for you.
I think part of the problem, Sarah, is that, as
She
you
says
say,
as she's pissing herself laughing.
we had become so
I can
used
laugh
to
about
it.
it now. It's
We had become so used to it. We were taking it for granted. There's no two ways about it that it was always
yeah.
going to come back. Yeah, we did definitely. It's almost because it had run for 26 years, Dan. I think there is that feeling once you have got to that to a certain milestone, there is that feeling that, well, look, if it's gone for 26 years, it clearly is never going to end. Why would it end? So you can see it from one of two perspectives. Yes, it's gone on too long, or it's gone on so long that it's illogical for it now to end. And so I can remember really, the bubble burst in February '85 when with the first cancellation, because suddenly we were very, very aware that what we were taking for granted as would always be there suddenly actually might not be there. And that's why, Sarah, I think forevermore then there was a shadow hanging. It felt like it, didn't it, Dan?
Yeah,
That there
it
was a
did.
shadow hanging over the
Hovering.
show permanently from February '85 onwards. Permanently, never left.
And that's why I have so much sort of, the word respect gets bandied around too much now. But I really respect Sylvester McCoy, not just for jumping on board this show, which we'd now call a franchise, but to him, it's just a TV show, for jumping on board when he did, and for remaining on board when reception to his arrival wasn't great. Reviews were pretty awful.
Yeah.
And the knives were, if not still out, they were still very much in the shadows. I think a lot of actors would have folded, and he actually dug pretty deep. I mean, Sophie too, but Sophie was playing a new character in establishing Ace.
Yeah.
What Sylvester was doing was re-establishing the Doctor and kind of fighting against, really, the notion that pretty much this idea that was in the air that everybody else had done it better and there was nothing that could possibly be any worse than this. And yet the man persisted and arguably triumphed.
Well, and of course, the truth of it is now that he's still prepared to talk about it in the same way that Colin Baker might quite reasonably have turned his back on Doctor Who and said, I never want to talk about that because it's too painful and I never want to be associated with the show again. Sylvester could have taken the same approach because, of course, truth be told, he was there when it died. Nobody is saying that he kills the show, but he was at the helm when it died, and so he's forever going to be tainted by that. So he could quite easily have taken his bat home and said, right, that's it, I'm not playing this anymore. I'd never want to be associated with Doctor Who again. And who would have blamed him? So it's a credit to him, I think, that he's still stuck by the show, because I think it's fair to say that the show and thus the production team and the actors were treated quite badly throughout those whole 3 years. They were kicked around the schedules. There was no love in the BBC for the show at that point. There was certainly no commitment on the BBC's part to want to see it as a success. We can argue about the sort of integrity and the quality of the stories in the show at that point until the cows come home. But it doesn't really matter if you'd been putting the talents of Weng Chiang and the Robots of Death out. The show was.
That's what I've always said.
It was doomed. The show was doomed. It doesn't really matter what they put out. It was. I think the noose was hanging over it since February '85, and it was only a matter of time. Simple as that.
What I find really frustrating is when I struggle with this era. I really do. But McCoy is getting better.
Yeah.
I think for me, one of the high points is Curse of Fenric, which is also this season. And I just think if it had another season or another 2 seasons, I really think, it could have been. I'm not saying he's awful. I know he's a lot of people's favourite Doctor, but there was so much potential there that just got cut off.
I think you're right, Sarah. There was definitely a feeling that it was beginning. It never quite got back on the tracks for me, but I could see that it was getting closer to getting back on the tracks. And the frustrating thing was it just was never given. It was never given the break that it needed by the BBC. So they didn't commit themselves to it. They didn't let John Nathan Turner move on. He wanted to move on. I still think that had he been allowed to move on and a new producer had come in, it would have breathed the new life into the show that was required. And it might then have run for another 26 years.
I think the expression that we now use is that something's got its mojo back.
Yes.
And I think that's different. That's a different question to quality or even appeal.
Yeah.
But it had found its identity again. It had found what it specifically had to say at that precise time in our history, and was entertaining people in a way that, hey, at least they weren't gradually sort of ebbing away. The people who had remained or had found it in that intervening time were talking it up. It was just a very sort of slow crawl, really. I mean, 1989 itself was a really exciting year. The world had changed politically and culturally. Personally, for me, that was the year that I left school, which was terrifying in itself. At least Doctor Who was there for me to help with that transition. But in 1989 in Britain, the landscape generally, strangely, belonged to two Australians. Jason and Kylie were very much what 1989 was all about. I'm sure you'll remember this, Simon. These two were everywhere. Jason Donovan, Kylie Minogue, both of them associated with Doctor Who a little later on, and one actually going on to appear in it. But at the time, they were simply the darlings of the tabloid newspapers, of teenagers, literally all over the country.
Was
they were in the
just
charts.
teenagers? It was toddlers as well.
They were in the charts. They were on the telly. You could not escape these two. But the contrast between these two fresh faces from a faraway land and Sylvester McCoy roaming around with his Panama hat, it was pretty drastic. But it was an exciting time, and you did feel like you're on the cusp of something. So you've got Kylie and Jason going on there. There was also around this time too, so we're looking at the first week of December, yet The Simpsons aired its very first episode. It was a Christmas-themed show called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire. They'd first appeared on TV a couple of years ago as part of another show, but this was then them stepping out into a full half-hour show of their own, which is still running now, 35 years on.
Crackers! I can't believe that we're talking about this first episode screening back then. I remember seeing this as well. I can't even remember how I saw it, but I do remember seeing this episode. God, it's remarkable to think the cultural landscape had changed, hadn't it? Because the Simpsons, when you look at the Simpsons, it's a very knowing product, isn't it? It's very self-referential.
Yes.
It's nodding to itself. Whereas, and this is where, and as you say, fresh-faced Australians coming in, you can kind of see how Doctor Who was just looking past its sell-by date. It's difficult to divorce yourself from that, and you put yourself in the minds of the BBC executive at that point, the Jonathan Powells of the day. And to give them their credit, you can kind of see there must have been a degree of frustration that Doctor Who did look a bit tired, a bit of its time in comparison to these new cultural things that were coming through. I get it. I do get it.
I believe The Simpsons, in some ways, and that sounds ridiculous, is a kind of natural successor to the classic series of Doctor Who when it started to be shown in Britain, because it had that same cross-generational appeal in that members of the same family of different ages, different generations could sit down, all watch it together and get something of the same out of it, but something slightly different as well. I think that's what endured it. I'm not quite sure how it's looking now because I haven't watched it for several years myself. I think it's seen better days now, but at the time, it wasn't an overnight success, but it wasn't far off.
Well, again, I think probably The Simpsons has gone the same way the Doctor Who's gone. That it's had its peak, and it's maybe a little bit past its sell-by date again now, and it looks a little bit dated, and it's been there and done it, and that's true of just about any show, any film. What can you do? That's how it is. Things just run out of steam, don't they? And begin to look a bit tired and dated.
They do, and so was the Soviet Union around that time, believe it or not. Because in the real world, on December the 3rd, this was President George H.W. Bush and Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev. They met at the Malta summit. And this was the first real indicator that the Cold War was coming to a close. It was the latest of several huge political events that were closing out that decade. But I remember this too. So it felt like all times were changing in every way.
Well, yeah, and I can remember it so clearly that this did feel like just a complete new start for so much stuff. And as you say, the BBC was going through massive changes. So just about everything seemed to, politics was going through changes, as you say, in this country, but abroad as well. Everything was suddenly beginning to feel very, very different, very, not necessarily unstable.
You're quite right. Abroad and at home politically, Margaret Thatcher was beating off, believe it or not, a leadership rival to continue as the Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party. She'd been in that role for all those years, party leader since 75, Prime Minister since 79, 1980-ish. So, yeah, there was upheaval right across, both politically and culturally, but it wasn't necessarily scary. It was quite exciting in many respects.
Yes, I guess it was exciting because the world seemed to be shifting. I think we were coming out of what had been quite a sort of relatively safe and stable period of the 70s and the 80s.
That's how I remember it.
So whereas there had always been threats hanging over the 80s in particular of nuclear war and what have you, it still felt that we kind of knew where we were going and what we were doing, and the world seemed it seemed to be a known quantity. Coming into the late 80s and into the early 90s, it suddenly seemed to be an unknown quantity. Things seemed to be suddenly up for grabs in the way that they hadn't necessarily been before. And I can certainly remember just feeling a degree of instability in the late 80s and the early 90s. Things that the wheels seemed to be coming off in a way. Things were shifting. I think that's how I felt.
Thank heaven we had the new kids on the block, Sarah. They scored with their breakout hit. You got it, The Right Stuff. This was UK number one the week of December the 6th, 1989, the week that the final episode of Classic Doctor Who was broadcast. Do you remember the new kids then?
I do, because I had cousins who were older than me, a few years older than me, and obviously they'd got it. So yes, this Christmas it was relentless. Just hearing that song
over and over and over again. Yeah, I remember this as well. I wasn't a fan. I was keener on the film that was the number one movie that week. That was Back to the Future 2, finally released. We'd been promised a sequel to Back to the Future for about 4 years. And there was rumours that they were going to make two of them back to back. The rumours were true, and Back to the Future Part 2. That premiered in Britain that first week of December as well, with Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd and Thomas F. Wilson and Leah Thompson. I went straight to the cinema to see this. You must have seen this too.
Not at the cinema. I wasn't old enough.
No.
But yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, I love this franchise. Yeah, I can see why this caused a lot more excitement.
Well, looking at this was the big screen version of time travel. This was getting literally the world was excited about this. This wasn't just geeks either, Sarah.
Yeah, it's such a shame. Like you're saying, I can understand, people looking at this and then looking at what's been on screen, for the past 3 years and thinking, okay, this is a bit embarrassing. This is what we're, just like all those years ago when Star Wars came on and changed, the landscape and everything, suddenly, Blake Seven, we want Blake Seven to look like Star Wars. We want that, that aesthetic, that, we just couldn't quite manage it on the small screen.
And whilst that year's run of Doctor Who stories had been better reviewed and people were talking about it, it wasn't always for the right reasons, and there wasn't that kind of counting down the weeks to the premiere, largely because the BBC didn't bother trailing the thing. So by the time it was spluttering out in its very final weeks, a lot of people had sort of forgotten that it was still on at all. But yes, Survival did end up being the final classic Doctor Who story, beginning its 3 episodes in late November and coming to a close on December the 6th, 1989. And we're going to be watching that together again in real time and letting you know our thoughts as we make our way there too. First of all, though, it's time to head back over to the fabulous Fandom Podcast Network to remind you about all the other amazing conversations being had, covering the length and the breadth of popular culture and more.
Thank you for listening. We hope you're enjoying this podcast. Here are the other great shows on the Fandom Podcast Network. Culture Clash, where we discuss the latest in entertainment and pop culture. Blooded Kings, our show covering the entire Highlander universe. Couch Potato Theater, we celebrate our favorite movies. And Time Warp, our fandom flashback show discussing a year in movies and our favorite retro movie, TV, and pop culture topics. Good Evening, discussing all things Alfred Hitchcock. Hair Metal Podcast, we cover the rock metal music of the 80s and early 90s. Type 40, a Doctor Who podcast, discussing the time-traveling Doctor Who universe. Lethal Mullet, an action film podcast covering the 80s, 90s, and beyond. Also, check out the Lethal Mullet Network for more great podcasts. What a Piece of Junk, our Star Wars podcast. Making Treks, a Star Trek podcast, with a deep dive into the final frontier. The Fandom Show, our Fandom Podcast Network live YouTube show discussing the hottest topics in fandom. The True Believers MCU podcast discussing the Marvel Cinematic and Television Universe. Union Federation, our Star Trek and the Orville show. And we're proud to welcome the BQN Network to the Fandom Podcast Network. Please visit our friends on the BQN Network, a Star Trek Universe podcast that also includes your favorite topics, movies, history, superheroes, and more. You can find the Fandom Podcast Network on YouTube. The Fandom Podcast Network is also on all major podcast platforms. The Fandom Podcast Network audio master feed is on Podbean at fpnet.podbean.com. You can find the Fandom Podcast Network on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can email us at fandompodcastnetwork@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, respect others and enjoy your fandom.
I think we're as ready as we'll ever be to go back there to December the 6th, 1989, and revisit that final slice of classic Doctor Who. That's Survival. Doctor Who Survival by Rona Munro, Part 3, from that fateful Wednesday evening. Here's the blurb from the Radio Times that the Doctor and Ace move towards their final confrontation with the animal inside us all. Oh, sounds great.
Does sound quite chilling when you say it like
It does,
that.
yeah.
Oh, God. That use of the word final as well, it does make you wonder. Yes, so have your legitimately purchased DVD download or Blu-ray to hand. We'll be pressing play together here on Survival Part 3 in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Do you know, I still love these titles.
So do
know
I.
They're very, very dated. I do get it. They are very dated. That's particularly those meteorites or whatever. They're rolled up, scrumbled bits of paper, whatever they were. But I love this bit with the TARDIS coming in. I just
like
love
the
this.
TARDIS, yeah.
And I like the theme music. I'm not a fan of Kev McCulloch by any means. I really didn't like his incidental music. But I think this is a cracking version of the theme.
I've grown to like it. I didn't like it. I've always found it a bit whiny, but then can you remember how Capaldi's were kind of that similar kind of sound? So I have got used to it now.
I think the reason why it works is because it does heighten your anticipation for what's coming in the same way that the 70s theme did in particular.
Yeah.
I look at the Bowie T-shirt in the back there. I remember being so excited by the fact that character is wearing a David Bowie Let's Dance T-shirt.
Yeah.
I was made up with that. That was one of the highlights of the
Well, it was a very rare example, Simon, of any kind outside cultural reference to anything at all.
You never got it in Doctor Who, and so it was really odd to see a very clear Bowie T-shirt saying Bowie across it. It was really odd.
I remember when it became obvious throughout the closing moments of part 2, and the realization that Ace was the one who was infected with the planet, if you like, that was possessed by the planet, and having that realization that this was probably going to be it for the time being. I remember thinking, oh God, something really unpleasant could actually happen to Ace this time.
And of course, loads was being talked about the lesbian subtext of this. It's, is it a lesbian love story? Who knows? Difficult to say, but a lot is talked about with it.
It's harmless enough, isn't it? If people want to see that, and I never saw it at the time, and to be honest, I still don't now.
No,
but if people,
I didn't see it at the time either, Dan, and that's the beauty of good storytelling. It's there if you want to see it, and if you don't, it passes over you, and that's the way to do it, definitely. But when I look,
there's
now,
Simon, there's chaste, like she's being now, and chaste, isn't there?
Yes,
but I do kind of look at that now, and it is quite sensual. It is quite erotic in a way.
I was far more concerned about the fact that this the interior of this flat looks like something from the 1950s. Wow.
Oh, it's true. Actually, it's not very 80s, is it? That's a good observation, actually, Dan. Those contact lenses must have hurt a hell of a lot, and the teeth.
But having said that, a lot of nans and older aunties did have decor like this from 20, 30 years before, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. Yeah, totally.
Anthony Ainley's hair not quite as dark as it had been before.
No, yeah, looking at that, it's a lot lighter.
It's brown.
Well, I say hair.
Wig, bless him.
He's a fabulous actor.
Lovely to see him back, and he injects so much class and presence. He does, doesn't he?
In this episode in particular, I think he really rises to this challenge of being given something fresher to do.
Yeah, he's devouring those lines with relish, isn't he? He really is enjoying those lines, and you could say that he's kind of chewing the scenery, but he does it in such a charismatic way. And a charming way that he gets away with it.
He'd been playing the part for 8 years, but this was the only chance. This was the only real evolution of the character at all. And he's only able to take it a certain distance, but I think he relishes the opportunity. At least he's not being outdone, other than by the cats themselves, of course.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because Rona Munro was horrified by the costumes, because the last thing she wanted, as I understand, was actors in fur fabric, fun fur suits, which is exactly what she ended up with.
Effective though, aren't they?
Very effective. I mean, look at that mask. The mask is superb. This is something that you couldn't have done 20 years beforehand, because the technology just wasn't there to be able to create this kind of makeup.
No, I suppose not.
But now, by this stage, you could. It's the gloves, isn't it? You look at those gloves, and it is kind of fun fur, isn't it? You know what I mean?
Lisa Bowman played that part, didn't she?
Yes.
Cara.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now Doctor Who royalty.
Yeah, she's gone on to a very, very long post-survival career. She survived, to say that in every sense.
And the Doctor's got another gadget there, which we never see again. McCoy's Doctor has several of those, doesn't he?
And he's good with props.
He's
one of those actors. He's very much like William Hartnell. He's just good with props.
Yes. Yeah.
They suit him. It's quite dark stuff, really, isn't it? Because this went out, this. I mean, look at that. That is really
the carcasses and things.
Quite dark stuff for sort of 7 o'clock, 7:30 was it at that point?
7:30, opposite
Coronation.
Oh no! Well, yeah.
It was doomed. But it's good seeing horses. Do you know what I mean? Something like just seeing real horses gives this a real sense of quality, of gravitas, of budget, doesn't it?
You think if the horses weren't there, it
would feel flat.
It would feel flat, and I like the kind of. There's almost like a Western feel to it, like the music that Dominic does. It reminds me of that, and the vistas of the quarry. Yeah.
There's a real attempt to make it look like somewhere else.
Yes,
out there somewhere.
And I think you're right, Sarah, in that there was an attempt to make it sort of feel like a Western. Dominic Glynn did the music, didn't he? And
this is a great shot as well. with the doctors just over a shoulder like that.
It's great. I mean, it's great acting from both McCoy and Aldred in this.
Yeah.
I mean, look how Sophie Aldred has matured.
Yes.
In a short period as well. Only a couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. Very short.
And they're that close that she will go to him there as well, in as a patriarchal figure, as a father figure.
And in many ways, this is a very familiar theme within Doctor Who, where somebody, and often the companion, gets taken over in inverted commas by whatever it is. So it's a very familiar theme, but actually it's done in a very adult way in Survival. Quite a visceral way, far more visceral than it's done in a lot of shows where it's quite cheesy in a lot of Doctor Who episodes.
We look at the end of Snake Dance, even, which is arguably a far more sort of visceral and upsetting story, where it's all far more prolonged. All the Doctor and Tegan do is they sit down next to one another. There's no intimacy as such, but there is in this. There's a real bond there.
And it's lovely to see, obviously, this coming after Curse of Fenric, where, you know, the Doctor had to break that bond to save her life. You know, that's that, you know, they come out of it closer. I know it was filmed out of
season. It's the flip of that.
But you're right, Sarah. There's sort of deep undercurrents throughout all of this season. There's a lot going on in it. You know, the dynamic between the Doctor and Ace, it's complicated. And in many ways it foreshadows what was to come in 2005, when again the Doctor companion relationship became much more connected.
Yes.
The hub really of the show.
Yeah.
I even love that effect of them going back from the Earth to the planet. I loved it then, still love it now, simple as it is.
And I still love this whole thing about an unearthly child, which we talked about earlier, started in very much
because I was too holding. I'd forgotten that.
and now here we are in 1989, very very domestic suburban 1989.
Yes,
I still think this mirrors. It wasn't planned, but just coincidentally, it mirrors an unearthly child so clearly. That there's a TARDIS in effect just sitting. The TARDIS could be sitting in a junkyard here in the same way.
Isn't it lovely that people have still got front gardens rather than carports? There's no UPVC double glazing.
I know, it's lovely.
I just love this feel. As I say, it just feels so much of a bookend to an unearthly child. We've ended up back in contemporary Britain.
Yeah. No, it is. There's a symmetry to it.
There's a symmetry. That's exactly the word for it. There is a symmetry to it, and I just think it's
and even though it's
poetic.
broad daylight, it's strange that even though a lot of this does happen in broad daylight, you'd think that would mean that it wouldn't have any atmosphere, and yet it does. It's probably because the streets are next to empty. There's no people and very few cars. If there'd have been people milling around, it would have felt like, I don't know, they were on location for Midlands Today or something.
I think the feeling for me with Survival is I don't honestly feel it's the greatest story of all time by any means, but for the final story of the classic series, it could have been so much worse. And so I think, to me, it's almost a relief that actually it's a decent enough story. It's not the best, as I say, for me, but it is a decent story. It could have been so much worse. You know, we could have ended up with another Battlefield or a time in the Rani to end the classic series on. But it does
with this third instalment has got its own feel. In fact, I think all three parts of it have their own feel. Yeah. But as you say, this one being far more on the Earth in contemporary settings with real people, that poor little girl and these guys in the gym and things like that.
Well, I just think, you know, if you was a kid at the time watching this, and you've got that contemporary feel, you know, that could be right outside your house. Them stray cats that are in your garden, they could be kittens. I can see how it, you know, would have fired their imagination.
And the costume that he's wearing there, that is so 1989. but that means you're right, Sarah. That means you could relate to it. You relate to it. I worked with this actress here. Is it Carmen? What's her name?
Adele Silva you're talking about, aren't you? Who was very young at this point. But later on, she became incredibly famous, didn't she?
She was. I worked with her on Emmerdale.
Yeah, she was in
Emmerdale. She was in
Emmerdale, yeah.
Emmerdale, Sarah, and that's where I worked with her very, very briefly when she was probably sort of a late teenager, sort of about 15 years after this in Emmerdale. I worked with her, and she
Because
was lovely.
she was the kind of the seductress, the Lolita by that point in her teens,
Yes.
wasn't she? In her late
Yes.
teens, who was seducing a lot of older men to get their cash and whatever else, or permanent tan, all that. She was always in the papers. Always seemed.
Yes.
I never watched Emmerdale particularly, but I knew who she was, and I never put two and two together. That this was this adorable little kid in this.
Well, I know, and the sad fact is,
Catman.
when I was working with her on Emmerdale, I hadn't added two and two together. It was years later that I suddenly clocked, oh, that's the little girl from Survival, and I'd never worked it out at the time. Otherwise, I would have said to her,
I've no idea what
watched
she's
you in
doing
Survival.
now. Well, she's probably still acting.
I would hope she is. She was a good actress. She's great in this.
I just love that the Master was described as the bad cat man. That's just perfect.
Yes.
You're right about that suit. You would not have seen that suit in 85 or 86 or 87.
No.
And you wouldn't see a suit like that from, say, 92, 93 onwards. It's specific to this particular
very, very
time.
specific to the late 80s. He's a good actor. Does he go over the top? I don't know. It's difficult. Does he ham it up? I don't know.
I think it's sort of on the page, isn't it?
It's on the edge. It's very much on the edge. I think, truth be told, he hams it up, but does he get away with it? I think that's the burning question.
Yeah, he
because
gets away.
Anthony Ainley hams
He
it
gets
up.
away with it.
He just about, doesn't he? But only just. I think he's going for broke. I think he's aware he's got his big break in Doctor Who, and he's actually going for broke.
Thinking how similar, particularly in this one, the Master and Midge. It's not that far away from the Master and Chang Li in the TV movie, the Temptation.
Yeah, true. Actually, you're right.
The Possession.
As I say, those contact lenses, the yellow contact lenses they had to wear, must have been awful. I would imagine Anthony Ainley was probably quite grumpy about it.
Julian Holloway's got a good. It's a good part in this.
Yeah,
it's a pity we don't see more of him, I suppose, and we'd never get to see his demise.
In many ways, my only sort of regrets with this is this setting in particular, the sort of the social club, the youth club, feels very, I don't know, it's a dull location. It's a very down at heel location. Do you know what I mean? It's not a very glamorous. It's not very interesting to watch. I wonder whether they could have got a better location.
This is all a bit of a. Well, it's a bit of a contrivance. I always think that they go where they go, and this duel is set up. But because, as you said, they are so good. Both Sylvester and Sophie have never been better than in this episode. I think they're better in this than in Fenric. Fenric gets all the attention. I think this is nicer. I think this is more. I don't think they sell it better. It's more subtle almost.
Yes,
that could be in the writing. I think Rona Munro is a better writer. I think that's what he is.
It could be, yeah. See, this is funny. Did you think that, this wasn't planned as the last one, but, they're pulling all the stops out. We've got the Doctor on a motorbike. Whereas now that would be part and parcel, wouldn't it? Like with John in Planet of the Spiders. Let's get John on everything, every mode of transport before he goes.
It feels like a finale. This does feel like a finale. It feels like a finale to the story, finale to the season, and it is, as I say, just about passes muster as a finale to Doctor Who. It's that bit. This bit I still have a problem with. I don't
it's
understand.
Bizarre.
I don't get it. Yeah, seriously, how can you survive an explosion like that? You don't even see them thrown off the bike. I'm going to pull out on this one and say it's poorly directed. I'm sorry.
It's pure Looney Tunes. He's Wile E. Coyote. You've just seen him survive heaven knows what, heaven knows how, with a bit of soot on his face.
There was a big fallout, wasn't there? I remember there was a big fallout because one of the stunt people on the bike was what was his name?
Eddie Kidd.
Thank you, Eddie Kidd. Eddie Kidd, who got paid more apparently than the regular
really?
the regular stunt performer, and the regular stunt performer basically literally walked off set in anger.
Wow.
Eddie Kidd was a big star in Britain around that time.
The regular stunt coordinator found out, who was on the other bike, found out what Eddie Kidd was being paid, and cleared out. He walked off set. He was gone. Didn't come back.
You know, the year before, the year before they'd got Courtney Pine, but at least Courtney Pine got his face on screen. We never see Eddie Kidd. We just know it's him.
Yeah, we should see it. Law tells you that it's Eddie Kidd.
I do wonder if the people who live in that general area know that their home was in an episode of Doctor Who. Probably don't.
I think one of the things that does set this period aside, sadly, is the lack of film. This would be so much better if it was on film.
Yes.
The video, the video does look cheap. It looks
and
like
the stuff on the planet,
show.
to tell you the truth.
Yes. Oh, totally.
As nice as the painted sky looks, it would have added again to that Western feel that you picked up on, Sarah.
No, absolutely, with all the horses. It just feels like a children's show, sadly, rather than
this gambling around on the top of a hill.
Yeah, it just feels very pedestrian, doesn't it? And
I do think, unfortunately, it's down to the direction. I think if they got a director like Graham Harper, he would have brought a much more filmic style to it, and I think.
Well, I think the stuff on the Alien Planet is fine. I think it's got. I think it's got that kind of quality, but this stuff up on the hill, I just doesn't.
Feels a bit pat, doesn't it? A little bit tame.
And see, that is chilling when Sophie calls out like that.
Yeah, and again, the previous, when he basically tells Midge to kill himself because he's weak.
Yes.
That's another brilliant master moment.
Yes.
He's ruthless.
See what I mean? Looney Tunes.
Yeah, it's this that I have a problem
this completely drags it down. We've had all
ridiculous.
that atmosphere.
Yeah, because how was the Doctor thrown that far into a bunch of rubbish that just happens to be there?
See, that line, though, very good, very good. It's as if the Master has played a prank on him there. It's as if the Master actually saved him from that crash somehow and put him there. I don't think I've ever read the book of this, so I don't know if that was part of the story.
No, I haven't read the book. I understand that the book isn't as good as you might think it would be, considering it's written by Rona Munro. I think it fairly slavishly follows the TV version without too much embellishment. I don't know. I haven't read it. This works well, but I wouldn't have. It doesn't work to me having her as a human now. I would have.
No.
I don't know.
It's the implication that eventually Ace would have transformed into a cheetah person. Yeah. Are they all people who used to be humans or various other aliens that gradually became cheetahs? That was never explored at all. It's never mentioned. Obviously, this is the kind of the big scene, isn't it? This is the big confrontation that, in some ways, the whole of the classic series is kind of topped off with.
In a way, the whole classic series is working towards this, isn't it? And that's why I say, fortunately, it does have a sort of epic finale feel to it.
Sylvester is fantastic in this scene.
They both are. And I love the new costume for the Master, which I think cost a small fortune. It was all made out of shot silk.
When he grabs him now, I remember gasping when this happened.
See, this took a long time to sit well with me because you've got these two intelligent people suddenly reduced to animals, which I know is the point of the episode.
Yes, they're diseased.
But there was just something about all that intellect and cunning and that that realization that if this is the last big fight between the two of them. And
they're talking like friends again at this point, not arch enemies. They're talking like old friends, acquaintances, and neither of them want to die together there and then in that moment.
Yeah, it's cleverly done, and as I say, they're certainly trying to pull out all the stops. And that's Sylvester's line, isn't it?
Unfortunately, that's not quite so good.
No, you take it away.
It isn't, is it? It's like it moves to a completely different director when it comes back to these scenes
Yeah.
somehow.
There was talk I read recently that this is a young Jackie Tyler, this character.
Oh, I suppose in a way it is, yeah.
Literally, some people say, this is Jackie.
Oh, really? Oh, really? Good
Yeah,
gracious.
you know,
I mean, as I say, in a way,
bandwagon.
you can see the connection between Survival and Rose. There's
Yeah.
no two ways about it. You can see there is a thematic similarity there. They were going in the direction with this that Russell T Davies would ultimately go in with Rose. Yeah, you know, I mean, I can absolutely see the sort of the lesbian overtones to this now. It's there.
Do you think a fourth episode would have helped all that? Not necessarily with the kind of a literal lesbianism, but with the bond between the two characters, because it never really develops. They go for a jog together, for crying out loud. They go for a bit of lunch.
Why she got that upset about dying because she barely.
I suppose she thinks she's lost the Doctor at this point as well, though, doesn't she? And then he turns up. That's a great line.
I love that she puts his hat on as well.
This is a beautiful scene. This is.
Doesn't he look like the Doctor there? Finally,
it is tragic.
It is tragic. It's just the word, Simon.
It is, because he genuinely is settling into the role. They both are at this point.
I mean, he was even better in Ghostlight in that respect. Obviously, that was filmed last, and you can't tell. But there's something about this moment.
It's a world apart from his first season. There's no two ways about it. Worlds apart. You know, I'd grown to like him at this point, whereas I didn't like him in season 24 at all. It bothers me. It always bothers me that this line is so obviously done in post sync rather than on location. You can hear that they're in a studio, which I think is a shame. I know
it's quite. Most people will say how much they like that, but I've never been particularly keen. I think it sounds like an afterthought because it's all so quick. It all happens so quick. There should have been like 15, 20 seconds in between one scene and another.
Of course. And the problem is because they worked with what they'd got, which was it, and it was ending. And so all they could do is just about throw something, a different line on that sort of had a very much a wind-up feel to it, which it does. But I agree, Dan. It doesn't have the poetry
that it could have done.
No, it was obviously done, right at the last minute. I do like it.
I don't dislike it. I just think, think of what it could have been.
I think I could have done without it. I think you could.
Me too.
I'd be happy just them walking
into the sunset.
Yeah, me too.
Would work just as effectively.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, it would. Yeah.
Then obviously the story picks up in the New Adventures books where the Doctor's getting loaded, and Ace is going to orgies, if you believe the Virgin books. But in truth,
the logo it's so late 80s, isn't it? That logo.
Yeah.
I like it. I do like it. Don't get me wrong, but it's a little bit messy. It's a little bit.
I hate that logo. I've never been a fan of that logo.
No, I get it.
The designer believed. I've read an interview with the late designer now, who talked about how he'd always seen Doctor Who as a live-action comic book. And so it was his attempt to do a kind of a Marvel-style logo, as it would have been then. But I think it just goes, to me, it proves not only that he didn't understand Doctor Who, but he didn't understand Marvel Comics either. Because it fails on both accounts. But at least, I say this for it was like no other logo on television at the time and probably since.
But it did look very much of its time. It's so late 80s. It's almost like a sort of surprise with Cilla Black kind of logo.
I would agree. Yeah, I think that's definitely in there as well. I mean, now of course, like a lot of things that you think, oh well, it's not this, it's not that, but it's tied to such a time which was so idiosyncratic. I suppose you kind of, if you can't live with it after 35 years, I suppose you're never going to be able to.
I can appreciate now because it is part and parcel of the 80s. There's nothing more 80s than that. logo. So as a product of its time, I can. But yeah, it's never going to be a favourite.
It's to have it reappear at the end of the title sequence in the way it does. That was quite new. I think that was an early show of
Branding,
in some respects from the BBC, because some American shows did things like that. If you remember, the Glenn Larson Productions would have their sort of shield come up at the end of it, and so it felt transatlantic in some way, in a very kind of homespun and half-arsed, typically BBC sort of a way.
It's a good episode. I do like it. As I say, for me, as much as anything, it's a relief that it's as good as it is. And it isn't as good as it should be. And I think, for example, you mentioned Curse of Fenric, Sarah. I think the atmosphere in the Curse of Fenric works a lot better. It's a lot darker atmosphere, and it needed that for me. But of course, part of the thing that we've got to remember with Survival, and this is where it does actually work very well on the Cheetah planet, is it was shot in an absolute heat wave, wasn't it? To the extent where one of the extras playing one of the Cheetah people, apparently, Sylvester McCoy sort of joyously tells this story, doesn't he, where she cracked, she had enough, she couldn't take anymore, and she just tore off the Cheetah costume and ran naked, was last seen disappearing over the sand dunes with nothing on, because she just couldn't take the stress of working in one of those, in fun fur, in a ridiculous heat. It was an absolute heat wave, apparently, 30 degrees kind of thing in the quarry, and the poor Cheetah people just were melting, obviously. Whereas Antonini was in his silk suit. I was quite happy.
Yeah,
that's one of those stories where you're never really sure whether it's actually true or not. You know,
but it's a good one. It's as John Pertwee used to say, why let truth get in the way of a good story?
Yes.
And I think that's definitely
Good
one of those
point.
cases where it's a good story, and I can't believe it. It does make sense, because it would have been murderous in those fun fur outfits. But I can see why Rona Munro is somewhat downbeaten by the outfits. Again, to me, as impressive as they are, it sort of puts it in children's BBC territory. It does, unfortunately.
Rona Munro was a quite fashionable, sort of angry young woman writer at the time, wasn't she? I'd never heard of her, but she'd won various awards. She was seen as somebody who was up and coming and exciting, wasn't she?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, she did go on to much bigger and better things. No two ways about it.
As a novelist.
Yeah, and a novelist and a playwright. She became very, very renowned and critically well respected. And so it was something of a scoop for Doctor Who to get her. But you're right, she was an angry young sort of Sinead O'Connor kind of character, wasn't she? Sinead O'Connor was also huge at just becoming into her own at this time. In the late 80s through into the early 90s, and so Rona Munro's, she's one of those angry young writers, and it worked well for the show. I think it was good to get a completely different voice in on the show.
I've always thought so too, and good that she came back as well for the Eaters of Light all those years later. That she wasn't above returning to a series that she'd contributed a small part to, and like you say about Sylvester. It could have been the case that she could have considered herself as the writer that killed off Doctor Who, but obviously too much success had followed that for it to hinder her.
It's nice that the Master is in that final story in the final episode as well. Again, it does give it. It is almost as though they knew this was going to be the last story, and they absolutely did not. At that point, when they were making it, there was no preconceived notion that it might be the last story. But it is almost that they did know, because Rona Munro does some good characterization and character development for the Master. So it feels appropriate that we have a classic, returning, well-known character as the villain, rather than, again, you kind of think if it was just a lesser villain, I think of something like the Armageddon Factor with the Shadow, where, it's just not a good villain. It's a very cheesy pantomime villain that doesn't work very well. So it's nice to see the Master there in that very, very final episode. It all feels very appropriate. It's a good end to the series, I think.
When we looked at the very first episode on our 60th anniversary show in 2023, we traded kind of accounts, I think, of how many times we believed we'd seen an unearthly child. Simon, I've seen it quite a lot, I think, but you were like streets ahead of me. I mean, you knew the episode without needing the soundtrack on.
Yeah.
This time it's sort of inverted. I didn't need to hear that either. I know every single line of Survival, just as I do for everything from midway through the Davison era onwards, really. I could recite it all now if pushed. And no, don't Instagram annex us with that. Thank you very much. But yeah, so I was wondering, Simon, how many times have you gone back to this? Because I know some of the McCoy stuff you told me, I was very surprised that you'd stayed away from for literally decades.
Oh, yeah.
But how this particular episode being the very last one, how many times do you reckon you've seen this, Survival Part 3?
Quite a few times, I have to be honest. I think it is one of the better stories from the McCoy era. As I say, it's far from perfect for me, but it is one of the better stories. I find it quite watchable. And yeah, for some reason, so I look at something like, I don't know, Time in the Rani, Paradise Towers, Delta and the Bannermen. I haven't seen those very many times. This, Survival, I have watched quite a few times, I have to say.
Because it hasn't got that sort of separation in the way that an Unearthly Child has, where you can watch it independently of the 3 episodes that follow it and pick up with a later story if you choose. It hasn't got that. But I do feel, personally, I feel that Part 3 does kind of have its own thing, its own vibe, its own feel, which could be actually more an outside, an out-of-world thing, because I was at a precise point in my fandom with it, and this was a real sort of heady evening. It was a solemn evening for me because the penny had dropped. I had realised this was going to be it. This 25 minutes-ish was going to be the last for however long. I knew that. I'd received the signal somehow, and so it was very, very solemn a watch for me.
But I also think that actually you could, in many ways, this is almost a standalone episode. I think if people, if the casual viewer had tuned in for episode 3 of Survival, having not watched the first 2 episodes, and they tuned in simply because they knew it was the last one of the season, I think it stands well enough up on its own that you could watch it just as it is, and you although you're not going to understand the nuances of what was going on in the earlier episodes, it works. It does actually work. I don't feel that you'd watch that episode and think, what on earth was going on in there? You'd get it. Okay, there's some cheated, there's some cat-like people on a planet. There's the Master. They're having a bit of a punch-up. You know what I mean? Yeah. It does work.
Can you imagine if somebody had watched the very first episode of Doctor Who back in 1963 and then hadn't seen it at all in between the 23rd of November 1963 and there's that show I started watching that I always meant to watch some more of, that's ending, and they just happened to catch this very last one. Would they even recognise it as the same series? Maybe.
I think they might, because I just look at that now. Look at them. They've both got a hat on. They've both got a scarf on. They both look very, very. Actually, I can see the lineage between Hartnell and McCoy far more than I can, for example, with Hartnell and, let's say, Colin Baker.
I was just thinking the same.
I can see the lineage there, and as I say, to me, the fact that both of them, both the first story and the last story, take place in what was contemporary, very, very much painfully contemporary Britain at that point, I think you can see. I think there is a remarkable lineage. The reason I'm saying that is, to take a completely random example. If the last story was the Robots of Death, let's say, No, there seems to me a gulf between that first story of
Yeah.
An Unearthly Child and the Robots of Death. I can see the connection between An Unearthly Child and Survival in the way that I can't with, for example, the Robots of Death, Inferno, Earthshock, to take all manner of numerous examples.
Well, I mean, it's going back to that patriarchal,
yes,
relationship, which I see, but it's the things like this, going in and buying cat food and him crouched down with the cat food. And I'm like, William Hartnell would have never have done that. It's that kind of the
Fair point.
bumbling side of McCoy.
You know what, though? I know what he would have done. I don't know if it was bumbling. I don't know if I'd necessarily call it bumbling. Because the moment that stays with me is when the Doctor leaves the shop and he's got arms are full of cat food, and one of the shopkeepers comes up to him and says, haven't you forgotten something? And he just looks at him. He says, what? And he says, money. And he goes, no, it wasn't that.
No, that is a good note. Yeah.
And he really underplays that. And the alienness and that absent-mindedness and slightly forgetting where he is. Because the Doctor knows what money is. He knows where he is, sort of. But he's got other things on his mind. Yeah. And that, again, is kind of Hartnell. It's kind of the baseline setting for the character.
The first Doctor would absolutely have done that. I look at these two pictures. I can see that they've got the same eyes. To me, that absolutely is the Doctor. I see the connection there. It just feels such a good bookend to the end of the series. Survival does in so many ways to me.
Oh, I wish I could see it, Simon, because what you're saying is all.
You can't get it. Isn't it funny?
I've never felt connect. The 80s Doctors. I've had a long time struggling, even with Davison, for different reasons. I have much to Dan's, disgust, because I know it's his favourite. But yeah, but it's weird that the 60s I can see it, the 70s McCoy would far too much the clown, but in a different way to like how Patrick Troughton was, because Patrick was pretend, that was all part of the bluff, like, and Matt Smith does it beautifully. But McCoy, I see little glimpses like this scene and things like that. I can see the glimpses where he's almost there, but yeah, he's just never quite worked for me. Sorry, Sylvester.
I feel your pain, and I totally relate to it. I agree with you. I agree with you totally.
You can't argue with it in many respects.
Yeah.
I can't. I agree with you wholeheartedly. It's never quite worked for me. See chinks of light through the darkness where it does work, and I think that were they, as I say, I just wonder whether they were let down, and I don't think any one person is to blame there, but there are chinks there that it could have worked, given a little bit more thought, a bit more care, a bit more, you know what I mean?
And despite the fact that he disappeared off into the shrubbery at the end, actually, generally speaking, I think he did end in a blaze of glory, and he's kept himself fairly busy ever since. Well, generally speaking, he's taken it easier, by all accounts, but God love him. Yeah, there's Sylvester McCoy doing what he does best and righting wrongs, even if it just involves ball bearings. It all counts, Sylvester. It all counts. Yeah, so earlier on, at the top of the show, when we first got together, we talked about how conscious everybody was that this could be the end. There was no acknowledgement of it. There was no press release, and there were no headlines either. This time, the nearest we got was a piece. Well, a piece? Not even a piece in the Radio Times, which at that point in 1989 was still the BBC's TV listings magazine only. That would change about a year or two later. It still passed with pretty much a whimper there, but there were a couple of letters made their way through to the letters page of the Radio Times. One from Alan Dobby, which sounds like a made-up name, Alan. I'm sorry. Alan Dobby was one, and Simon Allen was another. Alan said, I hope that Jonathan Powell gets the sack. Now, Jonathan Powell was the controller of BBC One at the time. He'd succeeded Grade, hadn't he, when Grade had gone upstairs. So he hoped that Jonathan Powell gets the sack. His decision to axe Doctor Who at the end of its present series shows he doesn't understand what people really want. we want Doctor Who to continue. So there's Alan. He seems to know it's out there. Doctor Who has been axed, and there's no comeback from that at all there from that one. But the following letter from Simon Allen, Simon opens with, I'm sure most people are aware that Doctor Who is in its final year. More than likely, it will be axed before or during December after 26 years. Does the BBC actually care, though? Which is a more reasonable question. I do, in fact, feel very bitter towards the BBC's dismissive attitude towards the programme. It receives a relatively small budget. It is placed against Coronation Street on a Wednesday. It has little or no coverage from the Radio Times. This very much lines up with, if not an embarrassment that you were speaking about earlier on, Simon, certainly a bewilderment and a kind of a frustration with the series that had obviously made its way through to the viewing public. Maybe Simon Allen was a dyed-in-the-wool fan. He probably was to be writing into Radio Times, but not necessarily, because you did get letters from punters, from license fee payers in this magazine.
You did, but I think that's probably Alan as well as Simon, because of what they're saying here. I think
they're in the loop.
Yeah, exactly. They were in the loop. That's received wisdom that we had from people like the Doctor Who Appreciation Society in particular, where it was being talked about openly that the writing was probably on the wall. So I think the fact that they're both saying what they're saying, I think means that they would have been diehard fans simply because the public were not aware of a threat to Doctor Who at that point. It had passed them by.
To some members of the public, Simon, they'd seen the news that it had been axed in 1985, and I did used to now and again talk to people who, by 1989, weren't actually. There was so little publicity for it.
Yes.
There were people out there that believed that it wasn't on anymore.
It had never come back. Yeah. It doesn't surprise me.
Because of it being tucked away. We've got a reply here to Simon's letter from Peter Cregeen, an infamous name, who was head of drama series at the time. And he does say, and this is a version of kind of things that he would say a lot later, I would like to reassure Doctor Who devotees. So he's read the room quite well there, isn't he? Yes. I would like to reassure Doctor Who devotees. That there are no plans to axe Doctor Who. There may be a little longer between this series and the next than usual, but I very much hope that it will continue to be as successful in the 90s as it has been for the last 26 years. A little longer.
Yeah, I mean, quite a
was this fobbing off, or did he jump
on
this?
What a piss taker.
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because this is where I feel that is just really quite cruel. If they genuinely knew they were not bringing it back, why would you say that? So I still wonder whether, I can't believe they would be so cruel. So I still wonder whether they just genuinely, they were just sort of kicking the can down the road. They hadn't sort of really thought about it much. They were just, well, it'll probably come back. Just tell them it'll come back. I don't know whether a decision had been made at that point that definitely 100% it was never coming back. And if it had, then as I say, Peter Cregeen is being very, very mean with his reply there. Very cruel.
Has he ever answered for his crimes against Whovianism? Who knows?
Fair point, because he's very much promising there, in effect, it will be coming back. It's just going to be a little bit longer. He's not saying we don't know whether it's going to come back. He's saying it is coming back. It'll just be a little bit longer to wait. So
bloody long wait, Peter. We have been reviewing part 3 of Survival, the Doctor Who story that ended the classic run after 26 years in 1989. We've been looking at the third and final episode, but it's all available on DVD and on Blu-ray too as part of the collection range. You've got a choice. You could pick that up as either a limited edition deluxe box set, which I think these things, they are still in print, I think, but some of them have been deleted. Not quite sure which one of those are still available and not. And there's, of course, the standard editions as well, which I know are available literally everywhere for a cheaper price. So there's plenty of ways you can experience Survival in full right now. And maybe we'll do a proper full-on review of it at some point. Yeah, I think it has its own flavour. It certainly is worth commemorating. if not celebrating. You know, again, I always say this. I say this too much, probably. Doctor Who fans are always celebrating something, or always noting something, some anniversary, some date, Sarah. And most of the time they are celebratory. But do you think it's healthy to observe dates like this that mark the end of something?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, but it's something that you love. I mean, we do this with people that we love, with the animals that we love. So why not a piece of you? I mean, you're talking to somebody who lived through that's splitting up, Dan. I mean, you know, and then
Not long after this.
So yeah, I'll always mark that day. But yeah, I mean, what I think is fascinating is survival. It's such a wonderful piece of television just to like analyze in its own right, because coming from New Who, you can see like the roadmap, as we said, Simon, before, where RTD was going to go. You can see, you know, the Master's relationship. I can see that in, you know, the John Sim Master and David Tennant's Doctor.
Totally.
And you know, the companion dynamic. There's so much that I can see in just that, you know, that 24 minutes of television. So for me, it's just fascinating to see, you know, where all that came from, and what, you know, what was inspiring Russell, you know, and the TV movie as well. I mean, you know, but both of them got DNA there.
Yes.
So yeah, I do think, you know, I can appreciate that. You know, I might not be McCoy's biggest fan, but seeing where my favourite show, you know, evolved from. Yeah, I just think it's wonderful to see. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, very, very much so. I think that they, in many ways, were ahead of their time, because television drama at this point wasn't doing necessarily what it is nowadays. And actually, I think in many ways, yes, survival in particular was a little bit ahead of its time. The whole of this particular season was certainly edging in that direction. But yes, you can see the thread through the movie and through to 2005 series 1. Yeah, it's all there. It is there on screen.
What goes around comes around. When it comes to Doctor Who, it would seem. Let us know what you think in the comments section. That was December the 6th, 1989. Is history about to repeat itself before this decade is out? Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Or if it does, that Doctor Who doesn't stay away for quite so long. Next time. Oh, I think she agrees, because that's the old girl starting up and calling time. On this edition of Type 40, a Doctor Who podcast, I'll be back with another one soon enough. Look out for that wherever you found this. It could have been over at the dedicated home feed for Type 40 at type40.podbean.com, or we may have rolled up on the podcatcher of your choice: Audible, Spotify, Amazon Music. We're absolutely everywhere. We're still over on YouTube, the world's largest streaming platform, on the Type 40 channel, with extended video editions of each and every show, with exclusive extra Type 40s, as well as our sister show, our live stream magazine show, Type 40 Live, completely raw, completely live, where anything can happen, anything can be said, and often is. So you can get all of that over at Type 40 on YouTube. We're still on the fabulous Fandom Podcast Network's master feed, loaded up with so many other treats for your ears. Never mind on the weekly. It's all coming at you practically on the daily. So please consider a trip sideways in time to get yourself more quality shows from the FPN. Maybe you'd like to have your say about all of this. And you can do just that if you head over to our social medias. That's Instagram and X at Type 40 Doctor Who, or you can email us type40doctorwho at outlook.com. Then there's always the Type 40 Facebook group too. Join the discussion, the never-ending debates on the merits of the classic series, the new series, and all new Doctor Who over there in the Type 40 Facebook group. Thanks for helping me through this one, both of you.
It's been a lot of fun.
It's been such a pleasure. Yeah,
it has
really
been a lot of fun,
it.
this one.
It doesn't hurt quite so much after 35 years, I must confess. I won't milk it. But yeah, I was distraught by the ending of Doctor Who back then, and that 25 minutes worth of TV.
Bless you.
What was
It's
it?
actually nice. It's the first time I've watched it with friends, so it's nice watching it with
Yes,
friends. Actually,
me too.
you do get a different perspective
Yeah.
on it when you're watching it with other people. So it's really enjoyed that. It's been a lot of fun.
And it's great to be back as well. Sarah, I know you don't do social media, but there are people out there on social media who will absolutely be pleased to hear you and to see you back with us here on the show. So, thank you for your company again, all those contributions, and lots more to come, I don't doubt. But are your Christmas plans, are they starting to firm up now?
We're getting there, so I'm making. I've got the tree up. Still got a lot of things to sort out. It's just, part of the reason why I haven't been on for so long, I'm just that busy. I've got, unfortunately, real life is keeping me away from the Whoniverse at the moment. But thank you for the messages. People have got in touch through you, or messenger through other people, and thank you for not forgetting about me. And I will be back soon, more regularly. I promise. But I've loved this. I've loved being back.
Simon, you do social media after a fashion, but you cherry pick, don't you? So where can people get in touch with you?
If they really, really actually want to get in touch with me, yes, they can find me on Facebook. If they go to Facebook, the Whonatics page, WHONATICS, which was really big back in the years of survival. That was what we were on. We were on a wave at that point. There we go. There's the magazine. There it is. Second Dimension from 1989.
The august organ itself.
In fact, I think that was January 1990.
Yeah.
And that was our very first issue in 1990. I think our second volume.
That's
of
right.
Second Dimensions. So there we go. Where we were celebrating survival
look
way
at
back.
that
then.
artwork. That's
Look
a
at that.
brilliant.
It's good, isn't it? It's a good piece of artwork. Not mine. I hasten to add.
Yeah.
But it's a good piece of artwork. And so, the Whonatics were absolutely riding high at this point in the late 80s. And so it's great to revisit. And we're still out there on Facebook. So come and find us on Facebook and say hello.
And you can find me on Instagram and X as the Spacebook, wheezing, groaning, ranting and raving about all things geeky inside and outside of the TARDIS, not just in TV, but in movies and comic books and popular culture generally too, as well as the odd drift into real life, only absolutely when it's necessary.
Avoid when you
we try and keep away.
We're not going to be keeping away for quite so long this time. Make sure you are notified, you are following, and you are subscribed and all that jazz. We always have the time if you have the space here at Type 40. Take care. We'll speak to you all again soon. Sorry for bringing back the pain of December the 6th, 1989. We'll see you for the next one, though. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.